Meanwhile, a fight over the independence of the parole board has sprung up after the decision to release Herman Bell, who was convicted of killing 2 police officers in New York City in the 70s. Last week, you may recall that we heard from Senator Pat Gallivan. He's very upset with that decision. There are, however, also advocates who think it was the right thing to do, and they're hoping that the decision is not rescinded or revisited. With me to explain more, we have Senator Kevin Parker and Laura Whitehorn, a former prisoner herself. Thank you so much for being back here. Thank you. I haven't seen you in a long time, Senator. Thanks for being here. So first I have to ask, do either of you know Mr. Bell? Have you met him at all? Have you spoken with him?
Yes, I've been visiting him for about 16 years.
Are you convinced that he's rehabilitated?
Yes.
And that he's not a threat?
He is no threat to public safety. I would stake my life on that.
Because, you know, the law enforcement community is very concerned. They've sent out an action alert. They're, you know, we heard from Senator Gallivan that perhaps there had been disciplinary issues in his record, though my understanding of the reporting was that he was fairly clean. And he's very angry about this, particularly since the law has changed since Mr. Bell was initially found guilty and sentenced.
Well, you know, I think that whenever we're trying to make a real change for social justice, in other words, when we have 2.5 million people in prison and everyone pretty much recognizes that something has to change, there are going to be forces who are pushing against reform. Think about the civil rights movement and Bull Connors. Think about how the police reacted to the civil rights movement. And I think that's what we're seeing now. Senator Gallivan should know full well that the parole board followed their regulations, that the regulations are becoming more modern, that they're looking at who the person is now, as opposed to in the old days when they used to look only at the nature of the crime, and the parole process was basically a retrial. Now we have a fair process, and he's a little freaked out by that because he doesn't want that to happen. He approved these parole commissioners.
Senator Gallivan,
yes,
you're
some
speaking
of them
of.
Twice.
It's interesting, though, you know, the governor and the mayor, who are holding themselves up as bastions of progressivism, both of them, in one way or another, have both expressed concern over this decision, Senator. And actually, the mayor has sent a letter to the parole board asking for this to be reconsidered. Now, part of that might be politics because these two guys are not getting along terribly well. But don't you think it raises questions when two supposedly progressive Democrats are saying that they think that Mr. Bell going free would send the wrong message?
No, not at all. I think they have I think it's politics, but I think that they have other constituencies they have to deal with. Obviously, the mayor has to deal with his, police union, and certainly, we have the governor who has to deal with.
They're at odds too, or
right.
with portion of the union. Yeah.
Right, absolutely. But they also want to see things that they think will be favorable to them, especially when you're at odds, right? So you want to find some place where you think you can give a little bit, especially being the decision has already been made by the parole board, essentially by the parole board, and they're his parole board nominees, right? And we did have an opportunity to confirm them last year.
Senator Gallivan said he voted yes, if I remember correctly.
He absolutely did. And so, and there was a lot of debate and a lot of discussion and a lot of negotiating over those appointments and making sure that they were. And he's very familiar. I mean, Senator Gallivan, I think, is coming from a place where I believe he believes that what he's saying is right. I think it's an honest disagreement. I understand where he's coming from, but I just disagree. I think that a 70-year-old man who's spent 45 years in jail, and there's no reason to both incur either the time or the cost, because when you start getting people that elderly and then you have to put them in hospice beds, it costs 3 times as much to do it.
Ask you a question. Do you believe that, I don't remember if you were in the Senate when they voted to change the law regarding the penalty for killing a police officer. Do you believe that life without parole is the appropriate sentence for that now?
No.
You don't? Okay.
No, because some of this stuff is based on the notion that it could be preventative, right? And at the end of the day, we know that even if the death penalty we don't use because we know that it didn't prevent crimes, why would a life sentence would also deter them, right?
Laura, so you are convinced that the parole board now is acting appropriately, does not need more oversight or transparency or any of what Senator Gallivan or any of the other folks who agree with him on this particular issue regarding Herman Bell are calling for?
It's funny that he should raise that because we've been saying that before, and now there is
when he was
attention.
a parole board member?
Yeah, and the parole board, everything was very hidden. And now it's coming out into the light because there are so many cases of people who were going back. Herman went to the board has gone to the board 8 times.
Yeah.
Every single shred of his personality and everything he's done.
He changed his response, right?
Well, yes, he explained that to the board about what brought him to understand more what it meant to take responsibility. But I wanted to answer one thing
Please, go ahead.
about Senator Gallivan's claim that he had gotten a ticket for assault.
He did say that.
He got a ticket for assault, and as soon as even the Department of Corrections looked at the case, they realized that it had not been an assault by Herman. It had been assault by one of the guards. The guard was suspended. There was an investigation. And in a situation where 95% of disciplinary claims against incarcerated people end up in a guilty plea, the Department of Corrections took away the ticket from Herman.
Which is unusual, you're saying.
So unusual.
Do you believe, Senator, I mean, are you disappointed? It seems that, and again, the sort of the caveat here is that it's not over until it's over, and it's not over yet in terms of the budget, but the most sway that you have, the governor put forth a number of criminal justice reforms on the table, as I mentioned, including bail reform, for example, the ending of cash bail for nonviolent offenses, which we know people are serving very long times and not having the ability to get their day in court. I don't know how much likelihood you have after the budget when the governor doesn't have that power over the legislature.
Well, I'm really first hoping that this will all get resolved in the budget. We still hope that both speedy trial and bail reform will get resolved this year in this budget. But, we think that we may get a second bite at the apple because we expect that on April 24th, that there will be some elections, that Democrats will be elected in the 2 open Senate seats, and that,
well, you're definitely getting one in the Bronx. I'm not so sure what happens in Westchester.
Well,
That's the one that
I think it looks pretty well, pretty good. Assemblywoman Shelley Mayer, our candidate, is doing quite well and has a lot of support, and we expect that we'll see a victory there. But we're expecting right after that the Democratic Party in the state and the governor will do what they said they will have done.
The recall Felder would have to come back, right?
Well, I think it's an opportunity for us to work all those details out. And certainly, like I said, the governor has indicated.
Know that?
I think he's pretty aware of it.
Okay.
I think he's pretty aware of it. And so we're looking, we think there's an opportunity. But our first position is let's get this passed in the budget. There's no reason not to do it in the budget. And let me be clear, this mostly affects jails. It doesn't affect prisons.
Right,
I understand. So this is not even going to affect their prison population. I understand them fighting to keep people in their prisons, although I think it's immoral. I certainly understand it from an economic perspective. In this particular case, this is not going to affect your prisons at all because these are issues that deal with jails, not with prisons.
Laura, very quickly, because we're almost out of time. My understanding is that law enforcement is moving, and I believe Senator Gallivan is potentially moving. They're calling for potential removal, not the senator yet, but other people of these 2 parole board members who voted yes, 2 of the 3. And also, if they move to try and legally force this to be reconsidered, do you have recourse? Does Mr. Bell have recourse?
Well, first of all, I doubt that they'll be able to because it was such a thorough opinion. But I want to make one point because there's been so much of an outcry and so much attention to the police reaction that people haven't noticed that there's a very large community reaction in favor of Herman Bell.
Last week, actually.
And there have been, there's a group letter of organizations that has 120 organizations from the New York Civil Liberties Union to the Correctional Association of New York. There's an artist letter that in 5 hours had 800 signatures. There was a poll on CBS News where something close to 4,000 people voted for. So I think that there is enormous community support, not just for Herman Bell, but for the progress that we have made in opening up the question of why should we keep people in prison forever. In most of the world, a life sentence, 45 years is more than a life sentence in Europe. So he got a life sentence. He did a life sentence. And there are people all over the state of New York. And let's remember that when the law enforcement says that they're the community, they are not the only community that exists.
Understood.
There's also the community that's been hurt by law enforcement.
So unfortunately we're out of time, but we should just make one more point. I believe that the family of the officer who was killed is also divided on this particular issue.
They are divided, but the son who's named after the unfortunate victim has come forward and supported Mr. Bell's parole. So we think that should happen.
Well, we'll continue to follow this story, obviously. I thank you so much for your time, both of you.
Thank you.